My parents gave my sister, Emily, $400,000 as a wedding gift, but when they offered to cover my wedding, they sent me a bill 2 days later. I paid it, but after that I cut off contact. Now Emily is banging on my door, furious at me for what I've done. Growing up, I never had the best relationship with my parents, but it wasn't awful either. They clearly favored Emily, but I learned to live with it. Emily, who's now 32, was always the golden child, while I, at 28, was used to living in her shadow. She got the newest phones, trendy clothes, and constant attention. Meanwhile, I made do with her hand-me-downs and worked part-time jobs from the time I was 16 just to afford the things I wanted. I didn't complain much. I understood my parents weren't obligated to give me anything beyond the basics, and I took pride in being independent. But things really hit me 3 years ago when Emily got married. My parents gifted her and her husband a jaw-dropping $400,000, which they used to buy a gorgeous house in an upscale neighborhood. Sure, it stung a little, but I was genuinely happy for her. At the time, I was doing well as a software engineer, had a good savings account, and was in a happy relationship with my boyfriend Mark, who would later become my husband. I figured my moment would come eventually and tried not to dwell on the favoritism. Fast forward to last year. Mark proposed and I was over the moon. After years together, he was everything I could have hoped for in a partner. We planned a modest wedding, nothing too extravagant, because we wanted to save for the future. We settled on a budget of $36,000, which felt reasonable for the elegant but simple wedding we envisioned. To my surprise, my parents offered to pay for the entire wedding. I was touched. For the first time, it felt like they saw me as just as important as Emily. They seemed genuinely excited, asking about venues and vendors, and it all felt heartfelt. I didn't expect them to give me anything near what they had given Emily, but their offer seemed generous and I was grateful. The wedding day was perfect. We had a small, intimate ceremony with close family and friends, just the way we wanted. My parents gave heartfelt speeches, danced with us, and seemed truly happy. For once, I felt like I was being treated equally, and it felt amazing. But that feeling didn't last. 2 days after the wedding, I got an email from my dad. I expected a sweet note or maybe a leftover wedding gift. Instead, it was an itemized invoice, attached as a PDF, detailing every single wedding expense they had covered. The email was curt. "Please settle this at your earliest convenience. Your mother and I expect prompt payment." I couldn't believe my eyes. The invoice totaled $35,463.89, down to the last flower arrangement. It felt like a punch to the gut. Mark found me staring at the email, frozen. When I showed him, he was furious. It wasn't about the money, we could afford it if we had to, but the principle of it all. I hadn't asked them to pay for anything. They had offered, and they'd seemed happy to do it. Now it felt like a bait and switch. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just about the wedding expenses. It was about years of being treated as less than Emily. When she got married, they handed her $400,000. No questions asked. Now for me, they were essentially treating their gift like a loan. It was cruel. After a sleepless night, I decided what to do. The next morning, I wrote my parents a check for the full amount and sent it along with a letter. I avoided a face-to-face conversation because I didn't want things to escalate into a shouting match. In the letter, I poured my heart out. I told them how much their actions had hurt me, not just now but throughout my life. I reminded them of how I had been independent since I was 16, working hard while they showered Emily with everything she wanted. I explained that when they offered to pay for the wedding, I truly believed it was a gesture of love and recognition. Instead, it turned out to be another reminder that I would never be treated the same as Emily. I told them this would be the last financial interaction between us. I didn't want their money, their support, or even an inheritance in the future. They could leave everything to Emily, as they always had. After mailing the check and letter, I blocked their numbers and took some time to breathe. Mark supported me, and for the first time in a long while I felt a sense of relief. But then the backlash started. Extended family members bombarded me with calls and texts, accusing me of being ungrateful and dramatic. They said I was overreacting and that my parents had done so much for me. Emily called too, furious. She accused me of tearing the family apart and said I should have just paid the invoice quietly instead of making a big deal out of it. It was typical Emily, always defending our parents. Why wouldn't she? They've always been her biggest supporters. I haven't responded to anyone yet, because I don't even know what to say. On one hand, I feel justified. After years of being treated like I didn't measure up, this felt like the final straw. I wanted to stand up for myself. But on the other hand, I keep asking myself if I'm overreacting. Am I being too sensitive? Was it wrong of me to assume they'd treat my wedding as a gift, the way they did with Emily? Should I have just swallowed my pride, paid the invoice, and moved on? Mark's family has been amazing through all of this. His parents were shocked when they heard what mine had done, and they've been checking in on us constantly. But the endless messages from my own relatives are starting to get to me. I keep second-guessing myself. Did I handle this the right way? Should I have tried talking to my parents before cutting ties? Or was it finally time to draw a line after years of feeling like I mattered less than Emily? Feel stuck. Part of me knows I had every right to be upset and stand my ground, but another part of me wonders if I've caused a rift in my family that can never be repaired. Maybe I could have handled things differently. What do you think? Update 1. Since I last shared my story, things have spiraled out of control. I never imagined that sending that check and letter would ignite such a storm, but here we are. Yesterday morning, I woke up to an email from my mom. It slipped through because she used her work email, which I hadn't blocked yet. The email was long and self-righteous. She claimed the invoice wasn't meant to be taken seriously. According to her, they never intended to cash the check. It was all supposed to be a life lesson about financial responsibility. She said they had planned to tear up the check after they felt I'd learned my lesson and surprise me with $100,000 as a real wedding gift. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A life lesson? What kind of parents pull a stunt like this on their adult daughter? It wasn't about love or fairness. It was about control. They wanted to test me, to see if I'd comply or stand up for myself. It felt manipulative and cruel. Without hesitation, I mobile deposited the check. There was no way I was letting them tear it up after this lesson. I wanted it cashed so they could fully understand the consequences of their actions. I replied to my mom's email with one short line. Thank you for confirming that this was a deliberate test and not a misunderstanding. Then I blocked her work email too. I was done with their games. That evening, things escalated even more. Emily showed up at my apartment, completely unannounced. She started banging on the door, yelling my name. At first, I stayed quiet, hoping she'd give up and leave. But instead, she got louder, shouting that I was being immature and blowing everything out of proportion. She said our parents were only trying to teach me responsibility because they were concerned about my spending habits. Hearing that from Emily, who has never paid her own phone bill and has relied on our parents her entire life, made my blood boil. As she continued her rant, I quietly started recording everything on my phone. I didn't know where this was going, but I wanted proof if things got uglier. She kept accusing me of tearing the family apart over something trivial, and insisted I needed to apologize to our parents. According to her, they never meant to hurt me, and they had always done their best for both of us. She said I was overreacting and that this entire situation was my fault. I didn't respond. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, quietly fuming, and let her rant. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, she left. But not before calling me selfish and accusing me of trying to cut ties with the family over money. Once she was gone, I sat in silence, feeling the weight of everything. Emily's outburst only confirmed what I had known for years. She would always side with them, no matter how unreasonable or hurtful their actions were. Later that night, the flood of messages from extended family began. Apparently, Emily went straight to our parents after leaving my apartment, and now they were rallying the troops. My phone blew up with texts from aunts, uncles, and even family friends. Most of the messages were the same, calling me ungrateful, accusing me of stirring up drama, and pressuring me to apologize. One message stood out. It was from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in years. She told me I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me lessons like this. She said I should be grateful they were willing to spend so much on my wedding at all. She ended with, "You're lucky to even have parents who want to be involved in your life." I couldn't believe how quickly everyone had turned on me. It was like they all decided my parents were right simply because they held the money and the power. Nobody cared about the manipulation or the years of favoritism. To them, I was just rejecting their supposed generosity, and that was enough to make me the villain. By this point, Mark was starting to get really worried about how much this was all taking a toll on me. He kept suggesting I take a break from social media and turn off my phone for a while just to get some peace. He did his best to reassure me that I wasn't in the wrong, reminding me of all the times my parents had shown favoritism toward Emily, and how they'd always used money to manipulate both of us. What frustrated me the most was the lack of real answers. My parents weren't reaching out to clarify anything. They truly believed their own version of events, painting themselves as the misunderstood parents who were just trying to help, while I was the ungrateful daughter blowing everything out of proportion. I started questioning myself. Maybe instead of sending that letter and blocking them, I should have tried to sit down and have an honest conversation. But deep down I knew how that would have gone. They would have twisted everything until I ended up apologizing for feeling hurt in the first place. That was the cycle I'd been stuck in for years, and I honestly didn't have the energy to go through it again. For now, I'm focusing on the life Mark and I are building together. There's not much else we can do but hope for things to eventually get better. Update 2. Hi everyone. First off, I want to thank you all for your responses. Reading your advice, personal stories, and supportive comments has really helped me process everything. The last few days have been an emotional whirlwind, and your encouragement means more to me than I can say. That said, things have taken another unexpected turn. A few days after Emily's visit, I got a call from my uncle, my dad's brother. I hadn't spoken to him in years, so I wasn't sure what to expect. He's never been particularly close to the family, so I figured he was calling to tell me to make amends with my parents, just like everyone else had been doing. Instead, what he told me completely changed how I saw everything. He said he'd heard about the situation through the family grapevine and felt compelled to reach out because apparently, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. 20 years ago, my uncle had gone through a similar ordeal with my grandparents, my dad's parents. He had refused to go along with their manipulative tactics, and as a result, they turned the family against him. They accused him of being ungrateful and even trying to steal from them. My dad, instead of supporting his brother, sided with their parents, which caused a rift between the two that never fully healed. My uncle explained how painful it had been to feel abandoned by his brother, and how it had taken him years to come to terms with the toxic dynamics in their family. Hearing him talk about it was like listening to my own story in a different context. My grandparents had used money and manipulation to control my uncle, just like my parents were trying to do with me. The more he talked, the more everything started to make sense. My parents weren't just acting out of character. They were continuing a pattern that had been set long before I was even born. They'd learned this behavior from my grandparents. And now my dad, who had once played the role I was in now, was repeating the cycle. My uncle also shared how refusing to comply with my grandparents' demands came with severe consequences. They cut him off completely, both financially and emotionally, and spread lies about him to the rest of the family. To this day, there are relatives who still believe the false stories my grandparents told about him. It was all about control, he said, and when they couldn't control him anymore, they erased him. Listening to my uncle's story gave me chills. It was like looking into a mirror. My parents were angry because I had refused to play their game, and instead of trying to see things from my perspective, they had rallied the entire family against me. After the call, I couldn't stop thinking about everything he'd said. It made me wonder if my dad's behavior was rooted in guilt. Maybe he felt ashamed for abandoning his brother all those years ago, and was now justifying it by doubling down on the same toxic tactics. The truth hit me hard. This wasn't about me. It was about them, their unresolved issues, their insecurities, and the unhealthy dynamics they'd learned from their own parents. In the days that followed, I continued to get messages from family members. It was obvious Emily had been working overtime to get everyone on their side. One of my cousins, who I used to be close to, sent a long text saying I was selfish and disrespectful for not appreciating everything my parents had done for me. She told me it wasn't too late to fix things and that I needed to humble myself and apologize before it was too late. Her words were just more of the same rhetoric I'd been hearing, and it was exhausting. That's when it all became crystal clear. I grew up in a family where love was conditional. Everything, financial help, emotional support, even celebrating something as personal as a wedding, came with strings attached. Now that I'd refused to play by their rules, they were cutting me off and isolating me, just like they had done to my uncle. Mark has been my rock through all of this. After my uncle's call, we had a long conversation about our future. He told me we'd get through this together no matter what, and that I didn't owe my parents, Emily, or any of the extended family anything. His unwavering support has been my anchor, and I'm so grateful for him. But even with Mark by my side, I'm still conflicted. My parents' actions have left deep emotional scars, and I keep questioning whether I should try to reconcile or just let it go. Is there a way to fix this without sacrificing my boundaries and mental health? Then something unexpected happened. I received a voicemail from my dad, the first direct contact he'd made since I sent the check and letter. His tone wasn't angry or demanding, like I had anticipated. Instead, he sounded tired. In the message, he said he didn't want to fight anymore and was willing to talk if I was open to it. He didn't apologize or acknowledge what had happened, but it was clear something had shifted. Maybe he was starting to realize that I wasn't going to back down this time. I haven't responded to my dad's voicemail yet. Part of me wants to call him back and see if there's a chance we can have an honest conversation, but another part of me wonders if this is just another attempt to manipulate me into feeling guilty. My uncle's words keep ringing in my ears. They'll never admit they're wrong because they don't think they are. If I do decide to talk to him, I need to be ready for the possibility that nothing will change. Right now, I'm still processing everything: the revelations from my uncle, the messages from family, and my dad's voicemail. It's all swirling in my mind, and I'm not sure what my next step should be. I want to believe my parents can change, that they might finally see me as an equal instead of someone they can control. But after years of being treated like this, I know it's going to take more than one conversation to fix the damage. For now, I'm taking things one day at a time. Mark and I have been focusing on our lives and building a future together. One that's healthy and free from the toxic patterns I grew up with. Still, the doubt lingers. Am I doing the right thing by standing my ground? Or am I pushing away the only family I've ever known? As much as I want a clear answer, I've realized that maybe it's okay to sit with the uncertainty for a while. I'll keep you all updated, but for now, I'm just trying to navigate this as best I can. Update 3. Hi everyone. First, I want to say how grateful I am for all of your advice and support. When I first posted, I wasn't sure where this was headed or what I wanted to do, but your comments have helped me reflect and come to some important realizations. One thing that really stood out to me was how many of you pointed out that I've spent so much of my life trying to make things work with my parents, forcing myself to patch things up and pretending everything was normal. The truth is, I've finally accepted that it's okay if things don't go back to normal, because I'm not even sure what normal was. The dynamic with my parents has always been unhealthy, and I've spent years ignoring that. Now, I realize it's okay to let go of the idea that things will ever be the way I wish they could be. A lot of you also challenged me to think about my assumptions regarding my dad's guilt. Looking back, I see that I might have been holding on to the hope that guilt could drive him to change. But guilt doesn't erase the years of favoritism, manipulation, and control. Even if he feels guilty, it doesn't mean I have to excuse what he's done or let him off the hook. At the same time, I realize that I do need closure, not for them but for me. I decided to meet with my dad to get the answers I needed, and to close this chapter of my life. When I met him, I could tell he wasn't the same person I'd grown up fearing. He seemed worn down, almost defeated. For the first time, he seemed apologetic. Not in so many words, but in his tone and actions. He apologized for how the wedding situation was handled, and for how Mom and Emily had treated me. He even said he'd spoken to some of our relatives and asked them to stop bothering me, which brought a small sense of relief. Then he did something I didn't expect. He tried to return the money. He slid the check I had sent him across the table and asked me to take it back. He said he and Mom had discussed it and wanted to make things right. But I was prepared. I told him as clearly as I could that I wasn't taking the money. This wasn't about a financial transaction. It was about years of being treated like I didn't matter, and no amount of money could fix that. I told him taking the check back wouldn't undo the damage that had been done. He looked frustrated when I refused. I think in his mind the money was his way of saying sorry, but he didn't understand that the deeper issues couldn't be resolved with a check. The silence between us was heavy. After a while, he said he didn't want to lose me and admitted that things had gone too far. He didn't try to argue or convince me to come back, which surprised me. He just nodded and said he understood. As I left, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I wasn't angry, but I wasn't relieved either. I had hoped for closure, But closure isn't as neat as we want it to be. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no emotional breakthrough. It was just done. I'd said what I needed to say, and now it's up to me to move forward. Since then, I've taken steps to protect my peace. I blocked a few more family members who were still sending me hurtful messages. Mark and I are focusing on building our life together, free from the constant stress of family drama. It's been nice to finally have some breathing room, but there are still moments of doubt. I know I made the right decision by standing up for myself, but it hasn't been easy. Some days I wonder if I could have handled things differently or given my parents another chance. But then I remember all the years of feeling like I wasn't enough, and I remind myself that I deserve better. Predictably, Emily hasn't reached out since my meeting with Dad. I suspect she's still upset about the fallout, but at this point I'm not interested in fixing things with her. She's made it clear where her loyalties lie, and I've accepted that we'll never have the relationship I once hoped for. Letting go of that fantasy has been painful, but it's also freeing. As for my dad, I don't know what the future holds. He seemed genuinely sorry, but I'm not sure if that's enough to rebuild a relationship. For now, I'm focusing on myself and my happiness. If I've learned one thing through all of this, it's that I deserve to put myself first, and I'm going to do just that. So that's where things stand. It's not the happy ending I might have wished for, but it's the one I needed. Sometimes that's enough. Thank you again to everyone who's followed along and offered support. It's meant the world to me.